Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Matthew Zmupi. I am the Executive Director of the Oxford University Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa. Thank you for joining us for the opening session of the Intercollegiate Model African Union Summit of 2014. So the Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa is an international network of youth aged between 18 and 35 years of age that was formed in 2004 by a group of students at Harvard University, most of them born and raised in Africa and studying in the US. They wanted to think about and do some work that would make a positive impact on the social, economic, and civic development of the African continent through developing young leaders, making use of intergenerational synergies, and networking both students, young professionals, and tenured activists and professionals in the field. Members of YALDA are action-oriented and eagerly traverse cultural and national boundaries to raise awareness, collaborate with like-minded peers, or provide mentoring for young Africans with leadership potential, helping them realize their short and long-term goals. Africa has achieved impressive growth over the past 15 years of around 5% per annum, emerging as the second fastest growing region in the world. Boasting the world's fastest growing youngest population, the continent is well positioned to continue its positive growth trajectory. However, despite this tremendous success, the continent faces a key challenge, leveraging the power and the potential of its young people. Africa's large base of unemployed youth threatens the stability and prosperity of the continent. And so one key question has emerged, and that is what needs to be done to ensure that young people are plugged into the continent's sizable opportunity, and how can they participate in the civic, economic, and political spheres of African society to overcome the challenges that face all of us today. Now, YALDA has taken a very unique step to seeking to address some of these challenges and to leverage some of these opportunities, and that is to establish a forum, which is the Intercollegiate Model African Union Summit, to engage young people on how we can address, one, our challenge of immense youth unemployment, second, the food insecurities that we currently face across the region, third, how to foster better, deeper, and stronger links between our countries, and thereby promote regional integration and regional cooperation. And lastly, what should we do about the problems of governance, democracy, and human rights that we currently face? These are the themes that we hope to discuss and interrogate today, and for the rest of your time at Oxford. And so given these problems, we invite you all to be conscientious, to be purposeful in thought, and to be open to sharing your ideas, your questions, and most importantly, your problems. Because I think this will really foster a rich and more promising conversation today. Without further ado, I have the great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Mampela Aleta Rampele. Following the Soweto uprising in 1976, Dr. Rampele was detained without trial and released after 5 months, and soon afterwards served with an apartheid banning order. She studied medicine at the then University of Natal and has a Bachelor of Communications degree, a diploma in tropical hygiene, a diploma in public health, and a PhD in social anthropology. She went on to become the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and then one of 4 managing directors of the World Bank, based in Washington, DC. Dr. Rampele is the author of several books and publications on socioeconomic issues in South Africa. She has received numerous national and international awards, acknowledging her scholarship and leading role in spearheading projects for disadvantaged people in South Africa and Africa at large. Dr. Rampele has served as chairperson of Goldfields, Circle Capital Ventures, Technology Innovation Agency, and as director of MediClinic Corporation Limited and Remgo Limited, and is currently a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. She was founder of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa and the Citizens Movement. In January 2013, Dr. Ramphele became the leader of Agang South Africa, a party for all South Africans which won 2 seats in the national elections held in May 2014. Post-elections, Dr. Ramphele retired from party politics to return to her role as an active citizen of South Africa and the African continent at large. Now, many of you have already met Dr. Ramphele yesterday evening during our introductory kickoff session and networking session. And I invite you all to still take an opportunity to get to know her a little bit better as she continues our visit.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to what promises to be a very exciting weekend of reflection and commitment to doing what we have to do to make our continent the great place that it has the potential to become. I have decided to speak to you today on active citizenship and servant leadership for a Pan-Africanism of the 21st century. I would like to start with a quote from John Henry Clark, who is an African-American historian who had this to say: "History is not everything, but it is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. More importantly, what they must be." You asked me to speak to the theme of your summit, celebrating Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. The assumption is that there is something to celebrate about our achievements and successes with regard to these 2 themes on our beloved continent. Africa has made progress over the last 30 years in liberating itself from imperialism and colonial conquest. Africa has also made progress in transforming the Organization of African Unity into the African Union. It has also embraced the notion of an African Renaissance and spelled out through the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, how it would promote good governance and investment in people as the foundations of its renewal and rebirth. The question we cannot escape is whether these achievements and successes do justice to our potential as the continent that is the cradle of humanity, and one that is richly endowed with natural, mineral, and human resources. My contribution will focus more on the unlocking of the potential for greatness that seem to have eluded Africa thus far. In speaking on active citizenship and servant leadership for a Pan-Africanism of the 21st century, I intend to challenge you to complete the task my generation and those before me have failed to discharge. You are the generation to whom this historic mission has been entrusted. You are the generation that must rise to Mahatma Gandhi's challenge to be the change you want to see. In my talk, I would like to cover the following themes. First, history, our stories. Second, active citizenship. Third, servant leadership. And fourth, reframing Pan-Africanism with a citizen focus. Let's start with history as our stories. John Henry Clark, whom I quoted earlier on, challenges us not to regard history as everything. He reminds us that history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. Your presence here today as young African leaders at Oxford University and at this Intercollegiate Model of African Union Summit is an opportunity for you to use your history as an individual, as a citizen, and as a citizen of the African continent to tell your political and cultural time of day. What aspect of your personal, professional, and political time of day are you prepared to tell yourself and those around you? What aspect of your personal, professional, and cultural time are you ready to tell yourself and those who are here with you, as well as those back home? Imagine if each one of us were to be willing to tell our political and cultural time of day to ourselves and to share our reflections on the collective African citizens' time of day. Imagine. History would then be transformed into our stories. Storytelling is a strong element of our collective culture as Africans. Stories bring to life in words, in idioms, in images, and the emotional engagement that the connectedness of humanity and our connectedness as citizens of this universe that we inhabit can then be energized. Every personal story adds to the collective stories that tell us who we are, but importantly, what we must be. Maya Angelou, that great African American, is more explicit in asserting that, and I quote, "For Africa, to me, is more than a glamorous fact. It is a historical truth. No man," I would add woman, "can know where he is going unless he also knows exactly where he has been and exactly how he arrived at this present place." Do we exactly know where we have been as African citizens? Note the emphasis on exactly, not some wishful place we imagine to have been to. Do we know exactly how we arrived at this present place? The present place, in my view, is not a place where we can celebrate Pan-Africanism nor celebrate the African Renaissance. What with the unending conflicts, wars, poverty, inequality, and now, sadly, the devastation of Ebola? There's been much said about Africa Rising by the likes of McKinsey, Ernst & Young. In my view, that is an aspirational place we would like to have arrived at. But the reality of Africa Rising remains elusive. Africa can only rise when we meet the obligations we placed on ourselves in the NEPAD commitments to end conflicts, to promote good governance, to invest in people, and to develop inclusive economic institutions. It is not enough to have a rising Africa measured only in terms of economic growth rates. Africa has the fastest economic growth right now. The bulk of that economic growth currently tends to benefit the small elite. Africa will only arise as the great continent it has the potential to become through adoption and implementation of an inclusive approach to socio-economic and political development. A rising Africa must be a continent that fulfills its promise to itself of working towards African unity, starting with citizen-focused, accountable governance systems. Africa's key comparative advantage lies in its people, who are young, energetic, and resilient. I mean, all of you here tell that story. Africa's demography, with its huge youth bulge and an estimated 40% of its population being of working age, according to the African Development Bank, points to a future of abundant talent and creative energy. Stronger regional trade and industrial integration and sharing the lessons across the African continent has thus far eluded us. Decisions to merge regional development communities, which are currently overlapping in very significant way, and to systematically create free trade agreements over the last 10 years or so, have thus far not been implemented. And the core investments necessary in infrastructure to allow for free flow of goods and services are still held hostage to short-termism on the part of our leaders. The August-September 2014 edition of New Africa magazine details how major infrastructural developments linked to the discovery of minerals, including oil and gas, are being put at risk by short-term consideration that are fueling civil conflicts over the spoils of those discoveries. Pan-Africanism can only become a reality when each one of us is willing to ask ourselves tough questions about our underperformance in areas that would propel us towards our goals. Realizing our collective dream of Pan-Africanism and an African Renaissance depends on how you and I, as African citizens, engage to create a momentum for change and shape a future we can all be proud of. African citizens have thus far left it too long, to political leaders and private sector investors to determine the future of our continent. It is time now for us as citizens to stake our claim to what we must become and to shape our Africa into its full potential of itself. The time is now. So let's look at active citizenship. African citizens have by and large been missing in action in shaping post-colonial Africa. The notion of citizenship as a central core of democratic governance has yet to be embraced in much of our continent. The decolonization of our continent has not been accompanied by the psychological and institutional liberation of Africa's people from the bonds of despotic rule that treated them as subjects, not citizens. Mahmoud Mamdani's analysis in Subjects and Citizens offers key insights into the impact of the legacy of despotic rule on governance and social relationships in post-colonial Africa. It is striking that no African country has yet identified the importance of systematically undoing the damage done to a people treated as subject for so long. The framing of the relationship between those in government and the people who voted for them is in many countries no different from the way in which it was practiced under colonialism. Post-colonial leaders, with very few exceptions, have just stepped into the shoes of the departing colonial rulers without much hesitation. In many cases, as you would see on the screens in Zimbabwe, ceremonial white wigs and other trappings of imperial rule continue to mark the pomp and ceremonies of our countries. The fact that we speak unself-consciously about ruling parties and treat our presidents as royalty speaks volumes of the perpetuation of the subject status. The citizen is missing in action in African democracies. You can't have a democracy without active citizens. The citizen is the owner of the democratic state with rights and responsibilities of a steward and custodian. In many African countries, there is a conflation of the state, the government, the governing party, and the president. They are treated as one in our language and in our practice. Governing parties behave as if they own the state and abuse its resources as if those resources belong to them rather than to citizens to whom they, as leaders, ought to be accountable. The practice of conflating the state, the government, the governing party, and the president is a throwback to the institutional arrangements under despotic colonial rule. The governor in that model centralized command and control in the colonial government and was accountable to the colonial capital and not to locals. These despotic institutional arrangements were designed to extract the maximum benefits for the colonial power and to keep the subjects under control. Continuation of extractive, despotic institutional forms at the socioeconomic and political levels in many of our countries is evidence that it is not yet uhuru. The forms and processes of liberation struggles across Africa also distorted the focus from the people to the leaders. Liberation movement leaders, almost without exception, emerged to claim ownership of the freedom that was won. They asserted sole authorship of the freedom as only having been won through their sacrifices and efforts. Most of these leaders discounted the role played by ordinary people in the successful struggles for freedom. The discounting of the role of ordinary people in their own liberation struggles has undermined their power to claim the freedom they fought for as their entitlement as citizens. They don't owe it to anybody else. They are entitled to it. They contributed to it. Ordinary African people's capacity to tell their stories of how they liberated themselves to become citizens of a free country as stewards of the democratic state has largely been undermined. The narrative across our continent is that of a passive people being liberated by an elite group of brave fighters and heroes. The stories of ordinary people who actively defied and challenged oppressive colonial systems at great cost to themselves and their families have been buried under the mountain of myths that justify abuse of power by many post-colonial leaders. The silencing or the discounting of ordinary people's struggle narratives has effectively disempowered them from assuming their rightful place as citizens. The silencing of ordinary people's stories has denied them the space to make sense of their place in the birthing of their countries as free countries. This silencing perpetuates the subject status of African people. Subjects are people without stories of their own. Subjects are people without stories of their own. Silencing ordinary people's stories also denies them the space to find meaning in their own lives and their environments. African people with silent stories tend to end up accepting that theirs is to be grateful to their liberators, who have, in large measure, become despotic rulers. How else do we explain our tolerance of the abuse of power on the continent? The citizen as steward and custodian of the democratic state can only come alive if we heed John Henry Clarke's injunction that history tells us where we are, but more importantly, what we must be. This summit presents you with the opportunity as young Africans to embrace what you must be. Active citizens, I would suggest, of your individual countries and of your continent. You need to share the subject status that many African people have embraced and proudly declare yourselves as the owners, custodians, and the stewards of your countries and your continent. My generation has been complicit in the usurping of power by elites in the name of liberating them. Liberation heroism narrative has disempowered the African citizen across the continent. Heroic politics have trumped accountable democratic politics. African citizens have tended to treat their leaders with deference instead of holding them accountable for performance against set national goals. The time has come for all of us to assume our responsibilities as citizens. The time has come for all of us to assert our rights and responsibilities as owners of the democratic states we hail from. Inter- and intra-generational conversations, such as we are having today, are essential building blocks of the future we dream of, a future we must forge together. Conversations are the heartbeat of democratic politics. How much effort are we putting into regular, robust conversations about our roles as custodians of our democracies? Have we not also fallen into the trap of cynicism and regard politics as too dirty for us to engage with it? The reality is that the very act of disengagement from your citizenship role is a political act. Citizenship is a political status. Being a citizen means being a political actor. Making the choice not to act is itself a political decision with political consequences. Many African professionals and academics have, for understandable reasons, abandoned active citizenship. Many have left politics in the hands of the least competent to promote the rebirth and revitalization of Africa. Africa's future will be shaped by the extent to which you choose to be an active citizen or not. Your generation needs to prepare yourselves for active citizenship. Such preparation starts with consciousness raising about the role, the rights, the responsibilities of citizens as stewards and custodians of democratic states. Civic education for ourselves, for your peers, and the generations behind you is an essential tool on such a journey. Every African country ought to have civic education as part of the education curriculum. Do you know that in many democracies, particularly European democracies, it is part and parcel of what you learn from grade R? How many of Africa's democracies has got civic education at any level? And it's not an accident. Civil society organizations need to agitate for adult-level civil education in communities, at work, and in places of worship. We must go beyond voter education, which is here's where you put the cross. African citizens need to know that they have options beyond what they are presented with by those intent on holding on to power at all costs. This brings us to servant leadership. What Africa desperately needs are servant leaders. Servant leadership is a philosophy and a set of practices that enrich the lives of individuals and builds better organizations and ultimately creates a more just and caring world. Robert Greenleaf explained servant leadership simply, and I quote, "The servant leader is servant first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first. Perhaps because he needs to assert an unusual power drive or to accumulate material possessions." Doesn't that sound familiar? Your generation has the historic mission to be the leaders you have been waiting for. You dare not wait for change to be driven by the current generation of leaders. They are too heavily invested in preserving the status quo. They are too heavily invested in the models of the colonial periods that they've experienced. Post-colonial Africa has not seen many examples of servant leadership. We are proud of those leaders who devoted themselves to serve their fellow citizens. The likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Seretse Khama, Kate Masiri, Julius Nyerere, Nelson Mandela, to name but a few. They were not perfect human beings. No human being is ever perfect. But they were motivated by the desire to serve and to contribute to the creation of a more just and caring world. Sadly, many of the current African leadership fall short of the practice of servant leadership. Just look at the extent to which they are undermining the internationally accepted principle of equality before the law. In June 2014, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, the AU met in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea, and they adopted the protocol on the amendments to the protocol on the Statute of the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. This protocol amendment grants immunity to prosecution for heads of state and senior public officials. Article 46A of the protocol states that, and I quote, "No charges shall be commenced or continued before the court against any serving African Union head of state or government, or anybody acting or entitled to act in such capacity, or other senior state officials based on their functions during their tenure of office." This amendment, if you are not aware of it, you better go and check it out, because it is clearly intended to undermine the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which upholds the principle of equality before the law. We should also bear in mind that the crimes for which these leaders are likely to seek immunity would be crimes against their own fellow citizens who are victims of human rights abuses related to power struggles between leaders, including atrocities during civil war. The AU, in one fell swoop, has created an incentive for those violating human rights to stay in office in perpetuity, against the will of their fellow citizens whom they might be abusing, in order for them to keep power and control over our countries. This AU protocol amendment poses the greatest risk to the liberation of Africans from the yoke of being treated as subjects. It legitimizes impunity by political leaders. I believe one of the actions you need to take is to decide amongst yourself, what are you going to do about this? How many African citizens actually know about this and the consequences of this protocol on our ability as citizens to hold our leaders accountable? The exercise of servant leadership is answering the call to serve. The value system that governs the personal, the professional, and the political domains in our lives as individuals needs to mirror the values of a caring and just Africa of our dreams. Leadership as service to one's country and fellow citizens is what your generation should aspire to. Living in a country led by servant leaders brings out the best in citizens as they build a shared commonwealth together. Studies all over the world show that, and I quote, inclusive political institutions tend to support inclusive economic institutions. This then leads to a more equal distribution of income, empowering a broad segment of society and making the political playing field more level. This is a quotation from Why Nations Fail, which I recommend to those who haven't read it. The success of Africa and Pan-Africanism, as well as the African Renaissance, is unlikely without servant leadership. Africa desperately needs leadership that is committed to creating the virtuous cycles that are born of inclusive political, economic, and social institutions. There is no place in such an inclusive institutional setting for subjects. Only citizens, as owners and custodians of democratic countries, can create the enabling environment for Africa to succeed. This success is achievable, but the responsibility lies on your generation's shoulders. My generation's role in Africa will remain an enabling one. Let's focus on the last theme, reframing Pan-Africanism and a citizen focus. Africa needs a new story. That story can only come from the collective stories of Africa's citizens. We must tell our stories of hope, of courage, of determination to succeed as the owners of our continent. We must not allow our stories to be silenced by heroic narratives that write us out of the history of our own liberation as a people. Your generation must now rise to your historic mission of completing the liberation of Africa through mindset shift of its people from subjects to citizens. You must assume your servant leadership role as citizens and mobilize others to do the same. Abandoning Africa to despotic leaders is not an appropriate response of citizens. You need to become the leaders we have been waiting for. Your generation has much more capacity than mine ever did. You have better education, exposure to the world, and access to information technology, and ability to mobilize across boundaries to build a huge Pan-African momentum for change. What is holding you back? Really, what is holding you back? Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest, had this to say, and I quote, "It is not the mountain we must conquer, but ourselves." The mountain inside us is what keeps us from trying to tackle challenges and complexities. Fear of failure needs to be confronted and overcome if we are to reach the summit of our potential as an African people. Failure is often the best teacher from which we can learn what works and why. I'm a prime example of a failed party politician. It's taught me a lot about my country. I was infatuated with my country, believing that it was ready for change. It's not. We have to work harder at that mindset change from subjects to citizens for people to be able to use the power of their vote to shape their futures. The summit is reachable beyond our fear of failure. You have to conquer fear and free the full potential of the persons you are. Pan-Africanism is unlikely to be born out of today's leaders with their short-term, extractive political and economic development approaches. Your generation as active citizens can and must start weaving your own stories and break free of the heroic historic narratives that have turned Africa's citizens into subjects. Active citizens must emerge from a storyline about what you must become: servants of the people and its leaders. Your generation, as active citizens and servant leaders, is in a position to reframe a Pan-Africanism that is citizen-focused, a Pan-Africanism that is built from the stories of Africa's people and the yearnings and the dreams that would make it much more possible for us to see an Africa that emerges as a proud place to be, that is sustainable. The ties between you as Africa's youth are ties of shared future aspirations for you to see your continent realize its potential for greatness. Imagine you going back to your respective countries, armed with skills, business, professional networks, and connected with the rapidly expanding ICT platforms that seem to have no boundaries. Imagine what you can collectively accomplish by supporting one another in your individual country struggles. Imagine the impact you can have on the generations behind you who learn from your example to rise to their opportunities of their full potential. You can and you must climb the mountains of colonial boundaries and reach out to establish inextricable links of commerce and industry to unlock the enormous natural, mineral, and human resources of your continent. Let me conclude. Africa's future is in your hands. My generation has done its bit, inadequate as that is. You now have the opportunity to take us as a continent to the Opportunity Summit. You, as active citizens and servant leaders, can and must discharge your historic mission to lead Africa onto a higher plane. Pan-Africanism, forged with citizens as a focus and led by servant leaders, is the only way to get Africa to meet its destiny for greatness. Are you ready? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rampele, for such a beautiful reflection and a very comprehensive and critical reflection on really the challenges that face us today. And I think one of the most poignant themes that has stayed with me today is about this concept of this heroic narrative and how we really need to think about our own voices and our own writing and making our voice heard, such that we can really start to forge our own identities in this great tale that is our continent. So I'd like to thank you so much for your reflections. And I would like to invite you all to pose some questions to Dr. Rampele. And just stand up, and I think we're small enough that we can hear each other, but if we need a mic, we can certainly get it for you. So if anybody would like to stand to take the first question, that'd be great. Yes, so please introduce yourself, give us your name and your country. Do you mind standing or sitting for this one? I don't mind standing. Okay, yeah, please say who you are and tell us where you're from and give us your question. Any takers?
No, it's listen. Okay. One of the things you mentioned, and of which I agree with you, is that citizens need to take matters into their own hands. And the question I'd like to ask you, yes, that is true, but in the era of our leaders who don't appreciate opinions, who don't appreciate us voicing out our grievances, if students strike, for example in Uganda, tear gas is thrown onto you, you're beaten up. In an era where if women activists go out, it's only international organizations that come to support us. Our leaders don't want to listen. Our leaders think what they do is right and they don't encourage debate. So how can the citizen get involved if there are no avenues incorporated by our leaders to encourage that involvement? Thank you very much.
You know, when you stand up alone, you can be shot down. There is no way even the most despotic leader can tear gas a movement that is in the clouds using ICT. That's why I believe that what we need in the first instance from this group of people is to mobilize your peers, and you can do it starting with 10 people who become 10 times 10 who become, you can actually grow in geometric terms. And once you are that interlinked, persistent force on ICT platforms, there's nothing they can do. I mean, look at what happened in Egypt. No one imagined that Mubarak would ever be moved from power. No one, because he used to do exactly what you're talking about. But when Mubarak woke up and found the whole square full of people, yes, they'll tear gas a few people, but it can never stop if you have done your homework. That's why I'm saying we had to go on buses, on third-class coaches to travel from one end of the country to another mobilizing, but we did mobilize. You can do it instantaneously sitting here in Oxford to mobilize people in Uganda. For example, this issue about the AU protocol. How many African young people in your generation know about it? So for starters, just getting people to know that we're sitting on a massive problem, and we need to agitate and mobilize not just Africans, but the international human rights community to say, we have a problem, and you at the UN must also must be mobilized to have a stand on what does this mean? Does it mean that Uhuru Kenyatta, for example, will not be prosecuted for the atrocities that he has been accused of? And does it mean, therefore, that he stays in power in perpetuity? He's a very young man, so you could be landed with him for the next 50 years as he avoids being prosecuted. That's a practical thing. The same thing with Museveni, who is clearly imagining himself moving out of State House in a state in which you can't do anything to him. So we need to be smart in how we mobilize in countries that are intolerant or listening to their own citizens. But if enough citizens are mobilized, young people, women, there's no way that a despot can hang on to power against the force of a mobilized people.
Thank you so much for that hugely inspiring speech. I have two questions, if I may. Sorry, okay. My name is Tamabatso Manweti. I'm from Lesotho in South Africa. I have two questions. The first is based on a comment. A historian by the name of David Anderson is developing a thesis at the moment. He's writing a book that focuses on the ways in which the Cold War period in Africa was in fact more impactful than colonialism in entrenching the types of state-citizen or subject relations that we've been discussing this morning. Basically, in terms of the relationships between the United States, the great powers, and African countries, for example, getting rid of Lumumba, entrenching Mobutu, and so forth, and many other leaders. Different African countries have similar stories. And I suppose that my question to you in that regard would be, what are the ways in which we can begin to renegotiate our relationships with the West and the East, and to remove ourselves from the enamorment of Obama or any other leader who would try to court our generation in sort of continuing the types of unequal relationships between Western interests and African citizens and so forth. My second question would be, given the ways in which the Organization of African Unity and now the AU has been seen as an African dictators club, much along the lines of the bill you spoke about that was passed in June. What are the ways you feel we can begin as young people looking at reforming the AU as an institution to allow it to include young people? And of course the work of YALDA is very important in this. But are there any suggestions about institutional reform in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamabatso. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's colonialism, post-colonialism, Cold War, new Cold War, whatever it is. If you are sorted out inside here, if our mindset has shifted from us being subjects that can be used by any of those people into citizens that say, it doesn't matter whether it is Obama or Putin or Blair or whoever. We as African citizens have a story, a vision, and aspirations that are not going to be affected by. We spend too much time analyzing what others are doing to us, and too little time understanding why are we vulnerable. Why are the Chinese not vulnerable to what's going on in terms of Cold War and so on? Why are the Indians able to do however well or not well? But Africa is preoccupied with what the rest of the world is doing to it. Can we start with what we are doing ourselves to ourselves? The mountain inside that Sahira talked about. If we are confident, assertive citizens, our leaders will not be hooked into all of these nefarious relationships. But because we are citizens, we are subjects, we allow them. I mean, you should see people grinning at the sight of Mr. Zuma. Now, yes, he's our president, but you don't have to grin. He is supposed to be accountable to you, not the other way around. But that understanding is not there, which is why people say, oh, he deserves his house. He doesn't. Whether it was 2 million or 200 million, he doesn't deserve a penny of my money because he is my servant, not the other way around. But unless we understand that, we will forever be studying what others are doing to us. Can we start studying what we are doing to ourselves and how we can strengthen ourselves to be our own dreamers, our own shapers of the future of our continent? That's really what it is about. The America of today or tomorrow will not take Africa for granted if African leaders were respectful of their own people and their people will be there to stand by them. But right now, they get told, come to Washington, go to Beijing, go. It's a shame. So I think that's really what's needed. Now, the African Union, again, what we need to do is to understand what the African Union is doing. Instead of simply the throwaway line that is the club of corrupt leaders, here is one practical example of this protocol. It has not been talked about in our countries. It has not been talked about at the UN. It has not been talked about at the Human Rights Commission. I mean, you, as young people, if you can mobilize 100,000 of you to write to the United Nations Human Rights Commission and say, what are you going to do about this? Because this is a violation of the Bill of Rights, which is the foundation of the UN system, that there is equality before the law for king or ordinary person. But by being silent, we are actually giving legitimacy to what the AU is doing. And so I think the AU as an idea is a great idea. But as an institution that is promoting inclusive socioeconomic and political development, it will not succeed unless you put it under pressure.
Hello, my name is Matilda Day. Thank you so much for speaking to us and taking time to speak to us. You spoke about the decolonization of our continent that has been independent of our psychological liberation, which hasn't happened yet. But how do we, as a small minority of an entire continent, get the people to trust us so that we can break the psychological liberation? When so many years we've had dictators that have come and gone, and the people have put up their trust in these dictators to liberate us, which is why we become grateful. But then another one comes along and another one comes along, which is why we have become passive. So how do we get the people to trust us who have been exposed, as you said, and want to change our country?
It was Margaret Mead who said, never underestimate the impact of a small group of people, a few individuals, that their impact on changing the course of history. In fact, if you go back to history, it is the only thing that's ever changed history. It wasn't a mass, it's not a mass of people who stand up and say, we've got to stop this war, we've got to do this. A few individuals, sometimes one person, who mobilizes others. So never underestimate the impact you can have. And you have the power of technology on your side. Now, the issue of psychological liberation starts with that fact. If you see yourself as insignificant, you're going to have a great difficulty in being a change agent. You've got to believe that you have the power to make an impact. And you are aided by amazing education, amazing information technology, amazing ability to communicate with people from across the globe. There is nothing insignificant about that. Second, the how of psychological liberation. I give an example in my book, which those of you who would be interested in reading it, A Passion for Freedom, how we started as a small group of students in the 60s, asking the question, a very simple question: how come Africa's people over centuries allowed themselves to be called non-Europeans, non-whites in my country? How come? If you don't ask that primary question, you can move. I pointed out to some of you last night that if we go back to liberation movement documents, including the ANC, We, the non-white people. Now, when you start from being a non-something, you are gone, you are finished, you can't succeed. If you start by saying, as a woman, I can't do anything, you can't succeed because we happen to be the majority. But men and women of your age, with all of the education, all of the knowledge, all of the networking capacity, you have to start by saying, it is on our shoulders. It is in our hands to change the course of history in my country and working with others in our continent. How do you do that? We've got to go back to basics. Someone was telling me about how women have gone back to skin lightening creams. Why? The hatred of the South. The black skin, there's something wrong with it. So you've got to kind of do something to it. In the end, as a medical doctor, I saw women with faces that are like this, and it's permanent damage. Why? Because of the inferiority complex we have against or about our being black, our being having short hair, our having, everything becomes a problem. Look at Michael Jackson, he died a mess, trying to make himself look like a European man in America when he had no business. He was just a very handsome young African-American man. But he messed himself up because he didn't believe that black people are as good as anybody, anywhere. Our languages are dying across Africa because we would rather speak English. You know, it's very difficult to pronounce your name. How do I say it? What? You know? So we have to start with those basic things. There are people with names that are ridiculous, to be called pretty, beauty. This. When you have beautiful African names, what's wrong with you? You know? So we really need to go to basics. That's how you unscrew that sense of inferiority and re-embrace your Africanness. Pride in who you are as an African person, man or woman. And I believe there is so much we have to offer. So much that we are already offering the world in terms of our culture, our music, our rhythm. An African kid just wakes up, is already on the beat. But others have to learn, gosh, how does it work? So there is something very special that God created us to bring to the human race. And we are actually disrespecting what God created, which is us. That's what this is about.
My question is this. I strongly believe in young people and the power that we have to make a contribution that can change the world. But in light of what's happening in South Africa, which is closer to home, where you have a young person like Julius Malema, who's almost overzealous and ambitious, almost too ambitious to change the world, I hope that you can advise on what, as young people, we can do to refrain from, advocating change in a way that could be bad or negative, in terms of giving us a guideline of what is too much and what could potentially go wrong if you're a young person and you're ambitious and you want to change the world, but you do it wrongly. Thank you.
Shall we take one last one?
Yeah? I think that too. Just take all three of them.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Salih Muntari from Manchester University, and I'm from Ghana. From all that you said, I realize democracy is a big thing you think would save Africa. We're democratizing the entire African continent. And in relation to what you said about Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm trying to relate to all that you said with his text, The Conscientism. Do you think democracy is something that Africa should adopt right now? Because democracy is an ideology that is good for countries that have high level of education. And looking at all African countries we have right now, I don't know if we are even ready for aristocracy. So are we ready for democracy? Or democracy we have right now, like you mentioned about the decision taken by AU, isn't it a way to support the tyranny of the majority? My second question is, you added that Africa is going to be one of the growing economies because we have a lot of youth, and it's a sort of advantage for Africa. I rather think it's a disadvantage because right now Africa is not educating the youth, Africa is schooling the youth. So we have many graduates who are searching for jobs instead of being able to critically think and start jobs to save Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Letitia from Ghana. So my question is, as you spoke about servant leadership, as the leader is a servant first, not a leader first. So servant first, and then you become a leader, and that is how it should go. So our skills and understanding of Pan-Africanism, as we have talked about today, should we wait for our leaders who seem to be leaders first? Should we wait for them to go before we, using the understanding of Pan-Africanism, mobilize ourselves to be the leaders that we want? Or can we, as we are not yet in those high levels, do something about them, the leader first leaders that we seem to have? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Katlero's question about the Julius Malema style of leadership. Julius is there because you guys are not there. We, as university students, during our days, we occupy the space. You are sitting back, that's why he's taken the stage. And you should see how many university students love the Red Berets. They're not stopping to say, hello, what is this about? How is this going to make an impact on my children and their children's children? That's why we're educating you, so that you can go beyond Julius. Julius is a product of this heroic politics and narratives of the ANC in South Africa. He is a real example of what happens with despotic leadership. It produces little despots, right? But those despots will govern you unless you stand up and mobilize. And I think it's linked to your question. You don't have to wait till they move off. They won't move off stage. You must move them off stage. And you won't be able to move them off stage being 100 of you. You need to mobilize thousands, millions, and it's possible. We have seen it in Egypt. They didn't have a game plan. You have to mobilize with a game plan. In a country like South Africa, we have a constitutional framework already, so you don't have to reinvent that. But you need to just make it come alive through programs and people and strategies that are constantly re-looked at to make sure that they are working, and when they don't work, you change and move on. That's why you are educated people. There is a purpose of education which is about molding you to become more resilient and adaptable. And this brings me to the question of democracy on the African continent. Democracy doesn't come from Europe or from anywhere else. It's a human thing. Go back to traditional African societies. Botswana is a prime example of how the Khama family, who were the traditional leaders then, were able to protect Botswana from this man in whose house we are sitting, Cecil John Rhodes. When he was marauding around southern Africa, this smart man mobilized his fellow tribesmen. They came to the Queen of England to say, we need to be protected against this roving lion that's going to be eating us. What else did they do? They also decided that they're not going to allow anybody to explore for minerals in Botswana. No one. They knew there was there were minerals. They didn't allow anybody to do it. These were uneducated people, but smart. Why? They believed in themselves. They trusted that they were as good as anybody. Now imagine those people having the sense to travel all the way to come here to make Botswana into a protectorate, and then ultimately to negotiate freedom and set up a democratic system good for Botswana, and to have a system of extracting diamonds which is good for Botswana. It may not be perfect, but at least you can track the diamonds to the investment in education, etc., etc. So we have to be very careful about assuming that Africa is an uneducated, unsophisticated place. Remember, math, astronomy, writing come from Africa. And we need to know that history. That's why I quoted to you this John Clarke's piece. You must know where you come from, how you got here, in order to know what you must be. If you look at homes that are happy, they're not ruled by a despotic head of a family. Families that are happy are democratic families in that unit. So for us to deny ourselves the benefits of democratic relationships. What are democratic relationships? They are relationships that accord respect to everybody equally. They are relationships that make you feel you not only have rights, but you also have responsibilities. And you are responsible for the well-being of your fellow family members or your fellow citizens. And they in turn do the same. There can't be a better system, because it has been modeled in the family. Well-functioning families are democratic families. So why must we go and look for some other system which we haven't seen work anywhere? So I really caution you to say that the issue about Africa is not that democracy is a bad choice for us. There's too little democracy, because we haven't yet had that mindset change from being subjects. We still have democracies run as despotic royal domains. That's what's wrong with Africa. When we have African governments that are responsible to us, accountable to us, that's when we will have the full flower of democracy. In this book that I'm really recommending to you, this Why Nations Fail, it's really important to show how, because they use examples across the globe, in every part of the world, to show how countries that have democratic, inclusive, not just politics, but also socioeconomic development models, succeed and are more resilient than those that don't. Part of it is simple, that talent is randomly distributed in human societies. So you don't know who's your next Einstein. And remember, when Einstein was at school, his teacher said, I really feel sorry to you as the parents of this young man. He has no promise as an academic. But Einstein didn't listen to that. He just pushed on. And here we are today. We're looking at him as a model of genius. The geniuses in Africa are numerous. All we need to do, and I repeat, the youth bulge in Africa is a plus, because Europe is having a major problem of aging. If we were to educate Africans and not have them jump the Mediterranean in boats that kill them, but they are educated and they're in Kenya, they're in South Africa, they will be recruited as professionals, and then you have proper adult relationships between Africa and the rest of the world. Like the Chinese. I mean, you go everywhere else, you find Chinese people. They're entrepreneurs, they're highly educated, because in China, education is regarded as one of the fundamental parental responsibilities, because it goes right back to their Confucian philosophies. What is missing in Africa is sufficient investment in the development of all young people. If we do that, we will be unbeatable, because we've got a whole lot of other things that Europe can only dream of. The issue of servant leadership that you raised, I really cannot do more than just simply urge you to start today. You have friends at home, you have cousins, you have, just make sure that by end of this weekend, they actually have heard from you about what is possible and what you can do together and what networks you are building and how you can link up as young people of this continent to really change it. You can and you must, and I know you will. Thank you.